Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com. Hey folks, today we're going to take a look at Aeon's End from Indie Boards and Cards. And I do have to say, there is a Let's Play video game channel that I watch, the only one that I actually watch with any kind of regularity, called Previously Recorded. And they have a sort of informal series of videos that they call Shut the Hell Up Already! And they did that because there are certain video games, like popular video games, that their audience kept asking them for over and over again. When are you going to play it? When are you going to play it? When are you going to review this? Come on. I would never pinch a title from another channel, but I was sorely tempted to do so in this case because the number of people asking me to play and review Aeon's End in the past year has been a little ridiculous. But I know that they mean well, so I don't really mind. But there are a lot of people who are interested in me playing this game, and I understand it because I love deck building games. I've made that very well known. I've done several top 10 lists about it. And some of my favorite games in my top 10 of all games are deck building games. And that's what this is. And it's also fully cooperative, which is a genre that I also like. So it's firmly in my wheelhouse. I just haven't gotten around to it. I don't have a particular reason. It's just, there's so many games. And I've got a lot of deck builders I haven't even gotten to, including this one. But I finally got around to it. And Aeon's End is like I said, cooperative deck building game, fantasy-based. It's sort of an interesting take on fantasy. You are all breach mages, the players, and your like fantasy home of Gravehold is being invaded by monsters from another world. There's different Nemesis monsters who are like the leaders of the smaller monsters, and they have their own special powers. You choose which one you fight against each game. You choose the mages that you choose to play as, and then you cast spells in order to fend them off. Now, this is done with some traditional deck building elements. Have a starting deck of cards, you buy other cards, you put them in your deck, you eventually get those cards. But there's a few twists, namely the fact that you never shuffle your deck. There's quite a lot more to it than that, but let's go ahead and give you a brief look at how the game is played. Then we're going to come back, I'll let you know what I think. Aeon's End is a fully cooperative game for 1 to 4 players. The players control breach mages who need to destroy a Nemesis creature before it destroys the player's home of Gravehold. If the players reduce the Nemesis to 0 life, or if they're able to exhaust its deck and remove any remaining power or minion cards that it owns from play, they win. If the Nemesis reduces Gravehold to 0 life, or all the players are exhausted by dropping to 0 health, they will lose. Each player chooses a character and takes their board. Every character has a different special ability that can help themselves or their allies, and needs charge tokens to activate, as well as different breach positions and starting cards. You'll each take 10 health worth of tokens, a token designating which player you are, and a set of breach tiles. These tiles will be placed in different rotations, depending on the character, with only 1 or 2 being completely open at the start. Finally, for each character, you'll take the starting deck and starting hand as indicated on your board, which is slightly different for everyone. You'll have a certain amount of crystals, a gem which provides Aether, the currency of the game, and a certain amount of sparks, a spell that deals 1 damage when cast. Each character also has 1 card they start with in hand that is unique to them. While not powerful, it fits their strengths and gives you a basis on which to build the character. This game is similar to other deck building games in that you will take this inferior starting deck and use it to purchase superior cards from the supply, adding them to your discard pile and eventually being able to use them, all while culling your weak cards and crafting a deck that is suited to your playstyle. However, in other deck builders, when your draw pile runs out but you still have to draw cards, you would immediately shuffle your discard pile and make a new deck. The big difference in Aeon's End is that you never shuffle your deck. Instead, you must flip your discard pile over without shuffling or otherwise changing the order of the cards, and that becomes your new draw deck. New cards you buy always go on top of the discard pile, and you can never change the order of the cards once they're in there. For that reason, the order in which you play your cards is incredibly critical, because you are also setting up the order in which you will draw and have access to them later. The other important differences are that you never discard unused cards at the end of your turn, and in fact can never discard cards unless an ability tells you to. You also have no hand limit. Back to setup. Set the Gravehold dial to 30. If that reaches 0, you all lose. Choose a Nemesis monster and place its board into play. There are 4 Nemesis monsters in the base game of escalating difficulty. They'll each have a different setup and different special effects that will be used on the players, including a unique effect that occurs when the Unleash keyword is utilized. For example, the Carapace Queen can spawn Husk monsters, Crooked Mask can force the players to take Corruption into their decks, and the Rageborn, set up here, can gain Fury tokens and eventually use them for Vicious Strike cards from its own unique deck. Like the Gravehold, there is a Nemesis tile that must be set to the Nemesis's max life points, which it can never go above. Regardless of the Nemesis that you use, you'll also have to make a Nemesis deck. There are 9 unique cards for each Nemesis, but the rest are common cards. You'll use a certain amount of these depending on the number of players, and set up the deck with tiered difficulty. The Tier 3 cards are shuffled and placed on the bottom, then the 2 cards, and then finally the Tier 1s are on top. These cards consist of powerful one-time attacks and also minions and power cards which will stay in play. Next, you'll have to create the supply of cards for the players to buy from during the game. There are always 9 piles consisting of 3 different gems, 2 different relics, and 4 different spells. You can choose each pile deterministically or use the included randomizer cards. Gems are used to generate Aether, which lets you buy more cards, rotate breaches, charge special abilities, and more. But some gems have limitations and bonuses depending on how you use them in conjunction with other cards. Relics have powerful effects that are used as soon as you play the card, including drawing cards, gaining Aether, dealing damage, or destroying other cards. Sometimes you must destroy the relic itself to use it. Destroyed cards are removed from the game. Spells are the primary way that mages will attack and defeat the Nemesis and its minions. They almost always deal some amount of damage, though some have support effects for you and your allies. To cast a spell, you must use breaches. More on that in a minute. The last part of the setup is making your turn order deck. You'll use 1 card for each player from 1 through 4 if you're in a 4-player game. In a 3-player game, you'll have to use the wild card, which lets you choose someone to take an extra turn. And in a 2-player game, each player gets 2 cards. No matter what, there are always 2 Nemesis cards. Shuffle all of these together after it's been set up. Start the game by drawing a turn order card to determine who goes first. That person, or the Nemesis, will take their turn, then draw another card to determine the next player. If the deck runs out, you shuffle it and then draw. Let's talk about a player's turn first, which happens in 3 phases. The first phase is casting. If you had previously set up a spell on an open breach during the last turn, it will now go off if you want it to. If you place a spell on a closed breach that you focused, you must cast the spell. You have no choice. Use its effect and discard it immediately. If it deals damage, adjust the Nemesis tile or remove life tokens from the minions, whichever one you targeted. Some breaches, when open, will give you a bonus to damage if you cast from them in particular. The main phase is the bulk of your turn, where the most stuff might happen. You have several options that you can take in any order. You can play relics and gems to gain effects or resources. You can buy a card from the supply by spending Aether you've accumulated, which does not carry over to the next turn, and then place it on top of your discard pile. You can pay 2 Aether to gain a charge, as many times as you want until you have no more open charge spaces. When that meter is full, you may use your power by losing the charges, though it can usually only be used in specific circumstances. You can focus your closed breaches. In the top quadrant of the breach tiles, there's an open cost and a focus cost, both in Aether. If you pay the focus cost, you rotate the tile 90 degrees, and then you may prep a spell there. If instead you pay the open cost, you flip the tile over altogether, and from then on you may always prep spells there without paying any additional cost. The cost to open decreases as you focus it throughout the game. You can also use this phase to resolve any prep spell effects, or any player may resolve the discard effect on a Nemesis power card in play to get rid of it. The last phase of the player's turn is drawing cards. If you have less than 5 cards in hand, you draw back up to 5. If you already have 5 or more cards, you may not discard in order to make room. And as stated before, if you run out of cards in your draw pile, you must flip your discard pile over to make a new deck without altering the order. If a Nemesis turn comes up, it has 2 phases. The first is the main phase, where the effects of minions and powers still in play are resolved from oldest to newest. Powers have tokens placed on them when they come into play, and you'll have to remove a certain amount of them when you activate them. If there are no tokens left after the effect, the card is removed from play automatically. You usually don't want to let this get to this point because those are powerful effects. Then you must draw a card from the Nemesis deck. These cards will damage the players directly or let the Nemesis use its Unleash ability more often. Attacks are resolved immediately and discarded, while minions and powers will linger as discussed before. If they have an effect that says immediately, it happens as soon as they enter play as well. If at any point a player's life is reduced to 0 by these Nemesis actions, they are considered exhausted. The Nemesis rebels in the attack and gets to use its Unleash effect twice. The player must destroy one of their breaches, and they lose all their charge tokens. At this point, they can still participate in the game almost as normal, but from here on out, they have no life points and can't gain any more. And any damage that would be dealt to that player is multiplied by 2 and dealt to Gravehold instead. If all the players are exhausted at the same time, it's an instant loss for the players. That is Aeon's End. Well, I like Aeon's End a lot, just to cut right to the chase. And as I mentioned in the intro, it would have been kind of hard for me not to like it. Deck building game, fully cooperative, and also a deck building game that tweaks and changes the system, not dramatically, but enough to make it more interesting than the plethora of games I've played that just feel like cookie cutters of themselves. That, to me, that's great. I mean, that's exactly what I'm looking for in games in general nowadays, something new and different. Even though I've seen the whole flip the deck over thing before, City of Iron did it, and I think I was racking my brain. There's at least one other game that does that, and I cannot think of it. Maybe someone in the comments will remind me. But still, it's not used a lot, and along with other aspects of this about how every player has a very unique, not very unique, but mostly unique starting deck and starting hand, different amounts of the 2 starter cards, and your own unique gem or spell card. All that together, it feels fresh. So I really appreciate what they did here. I wouldn't say that I love the game, and though I like it a lot, and I am going to plan to keep it and play some of the expansions. And I think the only reason I don't love it is because as I was playing it, and I was the only one at the table that thought this because the other players hadn't played this other game before, I kept hearkening back to Xenoshift. Now, they're not exactly alike by any means, including the whole deck flipping over thing, but the feel was somewhat the same as far as almost a tower defense type thing. I mean, in Xenoshift you have rows of enemies coming towards you, but you're still trying to protect your base. Same thing here. It's a little bit different as far as how the Nemesis monster and the monsters here are implemented in its powers, but still I was getting the same kind of feeling. And maybe it's just I like the theme of Xenoshift better, and I definitely like the artwork of Xenoshift better. I think the artwork and the presentation and the component quality of Aeon's End is probably the weakest link of the game. Not enough for me to not recommend it, but it's noticeable to me when compared to Xenoshift. And I don't know, it's just the one game I thought of the most while I was playing, and it doesn't stack up tremendously well against that game. I would rather play Xenoshift. But there are other unique elements of this game that you're not going to find in other games, including Xenoshift, like the whole thing with the breaches, which I found was interesting, and charging up your special powers. Basically what it comes down to is, in Aeon's End, you have a lot of options for what you do on your turn. And I do like that a lot. You have agency over how you're going to do your turn in any number of directions. Is this the turn where I just stack up on some cards? Well, I don't have a lot of either, but I can get a pretty decent gem, have a stack up for a better turn later. Is this the turn where I focus a breach in order to just get a spell out there because it would really help us out, but it's not going to help us long term. It'll help us next turn, but not really. And I'm committed to that spell if I just do a focus casting now. Is this a turn where I do that anyways because I'm planning long term, because I want to be able to open that breach eventually, and this is the breach that gets me a +1 bonus to damage. So it's short term versus long term planning, but basically it's always thinking, what am I going to do this particular turn, because I got a lot I can do. And I like that. And I like that the characters have different focuses for the most part. Your special power and your starting card, which you'll probably kill eventually anyways, will dictate a little bit of how your strategy goes different than the others. You might be more of a support role. You might be more of a just attack, get the most powerful spells, get out there. But you're not limited by that. You can do whatever you want. And eventually, if you're really running away with the game, everyone just might start buying the attack spells until they're all gone from the supply, and then just slamming the enemy and his minions as quickly as you possibly can. And that's certainly a thing to do. I think that most games of this are going to end up with the Nemesis being destroyed rather than running out the deck. But I'd have to play this game 20 times to know that. And I've only played it 3 times, so I couldn't tell you. Including solo plays, which works actually pretty well. The only problem with solo plays is the problem I have with a lot of games which is just like, it's hard. You want to play it with more than one character, but it's hard to keep track of stuff at a certain point. But it's not a big deal. So a lot of those different elements work when you have all these things that you can do. There's a decent amount of different cards for the supply, which also helps with the variety and the differences from game to game. There's only 4 Nemesis monsters, but I don't mind that. It's okay. I know there's expansions, but I try to review a game on its own first. And I think that's enough if you just want to stick with the base game for a while, because the variety of your characters makes a big difference in the cards that you can purchase for your characters. And also, there's a lot of different cards in the Nemesis deck, and so it'll be a while, I think, before you start to encounter the same things over and over and over again. It'll still feel fresh for quite a bit, I would wager. So yeah, I like a lot of that different stuff. The difficulty's a little uneven, and I'm not sure if that's a consequence of this game in particular, or just a consequence of these types of games. A cooperative card game, you're going to have shit games sometimes, you're going to have really easy games sometimes. That's just kind of what happens. The arc of the game is a bit odd, because in the beginning you can feel like completely not threatened at all for quite a while. And then all of a sudden, it's just like your woes have piled up to an enormous degree, or you just get a couple of really nasty power cards in a row. When enough of those power cards come out, and you have to make the decision, do we spend a lot of resources, either discarding cards or spending a ton of Aether on one person's turn? Do we spend a ton of these resources to get rid of that card, effectively, in some cases, neutralizing a person's turn just to get rid of it, but now we're setting ourselves back, and the minions are piling up, and so on and so forth. So, there are a lot of important decisions to make in the game. Really, the only problem I have with the game is just that the pacing of it's a bit odd, and you kind of feel like you're doing your own thing, you're doing the deck building aspect, which is unique in the whole thing. There's a lot of decision making as far as to how cards go into your discard pile, because you're just flipping it over. It might be a while before you see that new card that you just purchased. But that's all well and good, but while you're just kind of doing this, you can kind of feel segregated from the rest of what's going on. As in games like Xenoshift, I have to make that comparison because that's just what I'm thinking about. You feel this constant pressure of incoming waves of things, which can sometimes be a fault of that game because you never have a moment to breathe. But that kept the excitement and the pace going. And this one is kind of more lazily going about until all of a sudden things all go to hell. And that's a bit off-putting. And I also, as far as faults go, I don't like the artwork, and I don't like the component quality. The cards are really cheap, the boards are really cheap, and the tokens and such. And yet, overall, good, solid game. I like the innovations that they put in there that are different than other deck building games, even if they weren't the first to do it. And cooperative deck builder, I'm always going to be interested in that. I am curious now what the other expansions can add to it. Maybe they can have a little bit more interesting Nemesis monsters and more characters that mesh very well together and keep the pace of the game going, more difficult, but more consistently difficult as well. But hey, I am definitely willing to explore the game further, and that's definitely saying something for someone who's played so many other deck building games. So that is Aeon's End from Indie Boards and Cards.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon, and make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.